Here's the plan for today's grimdark daydream. We're dropping the Incredible Hulk into the 41st millennium to see who tries to weaponize him, who tries to erase him, and whether the warp itself notices a brand new storm of rage. We'll cover his arrival, first contact with Imperial forces, how the major factions would respond, whether his anger registers in the warp, a few cinematic matchups, and 3 very different endgame timelines. It begins as a bruise on the sky, a color that shouldn't be there, a pressure building in the air like a held breath. Orbitals catch it first, auger ghosts blooming green across naval cogitators, the prayers of the tech adepts stuttering as the readouts strobe between meteorological anomaly and unspecified warp event. The watch officer aboard the system monitor, Hereticus denied, feels his teeth hum. All the metal on the bridge resonates, a tuning fork struck inside an iron cathedral. Then the bruise tears. A slit of impossible light opens above the hive world, thin as a knife at first and then pried wider by hands no mortal can see. Clouds recoil. The slit becomes a wound, and everything inside the wound is the wrong color, the wrong physics, as if someone painted reality with a color that hates the brush. Lightning rips sideways. Vox channels fill with brushfire static and chant fragments. For 30 seconds, there is only screaming audio, machine spirits, unquiet wind, a heartbeat like thunder. And then something emerald and furious is flung out of the wound, like ammunition from a broken cannon. It is not a star. It does not burn like a star. And yet it leaves a contrail of boiling atmosphere and iron-scented rain. The object, body, hits the upper air at an angle that should have dusted continents and simply refuses to obey the math. It shoulders physics aside. Sky turns white. Hundreds of kilometers away, the stained glass of shrine habs shatters in unison, a choir of knives. In the sump-level markets, the ash on the ground ripples as if trying to crawl away. Someone looks up and sees a streak of green tear across the heavens and mutters a prayer they haven't used since they were a child. Emperor, hold the roof of the world. Impact. Not a crater so much as a decision. Wastes outside Hive Vardek 9 rear like an animal and then collapse, the ground puckering into a bowl of feared slag and powdered plasteel. A sandstorm of rust and glass expands in a ring, taking skin from anything that doesn't duck fast enough. The shock front slaps the hive's outer habs. Balconies peel. Pilgrim banners snap. A saint's bronze finger clatters away down 1,000,000 steps. Somewhere deep in the hive's spine, the transit rails hiccup and weld themselves shut. On the surface, a prospector caravan flips end over end like a child's toy. The lead driver wakes upside down, still belted into his seat, staring through a cracked windshield at a smear of green at the bowl's center. The smear is breathing. He realizes the breath is the reason the dust moves in and out in little tides. He blinks blood away and keys his Vox, but the Vox only hisses and repeats his own wheeze back at him. The thing at the bottom of the impact bowl pushes itself to its knees. The ground does not like this, and says so with a noise like snapping ship keels. A film of molten rock slides off the creature's shoulders and hardens mid-air as beads. Its skin is green, yes, more saturated than any living moss, but not plant, metallic in places, wet stone in others, a color the human eye uses to file memories under danger. It looks confused for exactly 1 second. Then it remembers to be angry. A storm born inside a skull breaks out of its mouth in a single sound. It is not a bellow designed for a throat this atmosphere would recognize, but the throat makes it anyway. The shock of it lifts dust into a halo and peels a layer of oxide from every wreck within a kilometer. The prospector swallows a sob because the sound says, "You tried to hurt me. Now it is my turn." Auspex teams from the local PDF crest the bowl's lip in four-wheeler crawlers with their siren lights spinning uselessly in the glare. The first team leader, Sergeant Maeva Trag, 15 years guard before a busted knee sold her to the planet, raises a magnocular. What she sees she can't report for a heartbeat because she has to move language out of the way to make room for it. Alpha-level Xenos behemoth she manages, because training has a gravity all its own. Mass, throne, just say huge, bipedal, musculature extreme hypertrophy, armor, number, no obvious plates. It's not right, it's growing. It's bigger than when it stood up. She lowers the scope and feels the lip of the crater shift under her boots, as if the planet itself is trying to roll away. Closer in, the Earth has failed at being solid and become a kind of pudding of glass and slag. Inside that pudding, footprints appear, where nothing steps yet. Then the thing's hand slaps into view, a shovel blade of knuckles the size of cargo crates. It tears purchase in the ground and drags itself higher by violence alone. Every time it flexes, dust boils off its skin and falls up. The nearest manufactorum priest kneels in the sand and marks a circle with a servo scribe. He whispers to the buzzing air as if to a shy animal. His acolytes crab walk forward with a tripod loaded with a phase chains generator, the unit's teeth chattering like metal insects. When they raise the tripod, a shadow falls across them. It is not a cloud. The air temperature drops 3 degrees for a heartbeat, as if the sky just inhaled. Then the creature jumps. It does not spring so much as decide on a new position and insist the world keep up. Sand craters, pebbles detonate. The tripod smashes into salvage and then into acolytes, who briefly become red diagrams. The thing lands on the lip, where the PDF crouch, and the world coughs again under the weight. It doesn't roar now. It just looks. Its brow draws down, the ridge flicking dust like eyebrows made of storm cloud. It is, for the space of a few breaths, a man-shaped question, the size of a cargo barge. Trag's squad does what trained soldiers do. They shoot him. Lasfire draws red lines across green hide, neat geometry that should end a life. The lines appear, glow, and then disappear as if dye on wet skin. The creature looks down at the afterglow the way one looks at a mosquito bite you hadn't noticed until someone points. A heavy stubber mounts up behind the PDF line, its loader jamming a belt home with hands that barely remember the drill. The gun speaks, hard consonants, official, a language that means business in any dialect. The bullets slap into the green and mushroom into bright petals, falling as glittering waste that still thinks it's lethal. The thing steps forward, and the ground steps back. A crawler tries to pivot. A tire finds a crater rim, and the whole chassis tips, shrieking. The green hand catches the vehicle by habit more than intention, and for a ridiculous half-second, it is holding the machine as you might cradle a toy you've just kicked by accident. Then the driver screams, and the thing notices that his screaming is loud to it, and for a second it is gentle. and then the driver's door pops off like the lid of a can. The crawler skids out of the hand's palm and flips, landing on its back with a spine crack of metal. Trug realizes she is standing. She realizes her legs made that decision without her. She realizes she is walking toward it, and also that she has already thrown her last grenade, and that she has a knife in her hand. She puts the knife away because the knife is an insult to the scale of the problem. "Back!" she shouts, and her voice comes out thin. "Displace. Fall back by fire teams left to right." It is the right order and the wrong reality. The creature breathes in, and the banner behind her snaps toward its mouth. In the hive above, the administratum gets a message that is not a message, but a rolling knot of clipped reports and curses. A junior scribe who has never seen the sky opens a new docket. Gamma entity, provisional. He assigns it a number and feels brave for the first time in years. 2 floors up, an Arbeits proctor slams a carapace locker and tells his squad they're not paid for Xenos, and then they go anyway, because that is what the badge means when it is heavy. On the wall of a shrine to St. Kethra the Unburned, a pilgrim ties a candle to a nail and hears a boom like an argument between planets. Wax jumps from the wick, makes a tiny constellation on the stone floor. The pilgrim leaves the candle unlit and goes home in a hurry, tripping on steps they have walked every day for 40 years. In the underhive, a gang lord hears the vox whisper, "Exterminatus," 3 times, like a rumor is practicing being true. Down in the bowl, the Mechanicus priest makes the sign of the cog and orders his surviving acolytes to fire the phase chains. They do, and the air howls as translucent links of inverted lightning spit out and try, earnestly, bravely to declare no to a being built entirely of yes. For a second the chains bite. They bite the way seat belts bite in a crash. The creature's muscles rise under its skin like tectonic maps. It looks down at the pale geometry stuck to its chest and hands, flexes once, and the chains fly apart in meteors of harmless light. The creature hears the sky, not sound pressure. The Navy has committed a pair of gun cutters, the kind of ugly angels that descend with autocannon wings. Their engines rattle the ribs of the world. They come in low, their pilots sweating into the yokes, machine spirits grinding their teeth with eagerness. The cutters open up, and the air fills with the roar and buzz of metal arguing with air. The creature looks up, considers the concept of above, and flexes. Muscle and soil make a pact. It jumps again, and for a second, the cutters are looking at a green face where there should be horizon. The left-hand cutter's gunner swears in a theater of languages and tries to rake the eyes. The creature slaps the cutter's nose as if disciplining a dog. The impact turns a 10-meter swath of armored prow into an accordion. The pilot overcorrects, the belly clips the crater rim, and the gun cutter becomes a skein of parts knitting their way into the earth. The second cutter rakes the landing zone with a burst that would have peeled a tank. The shots stitch fire along a shoulder and the creature stumbles, leaving a footprint like a new lake. The stumble is important. The PDF cheer without meaning to. The creature turns, angry at the stumble for existing, and plucks a sheet of fused ground the size of a hab room out of the earth as if it were pastry. It whips the slab like a discus. The cutter jukes, too slow. The slab kisses the starboard wing, and the wing, suddenly convinced of its mortality, departs. The cutter goes down in a cartwheel of fire that draws a line of smoke across half a county. Silence, but not real silence. The small sounds come back. Sand tinkling down aluminum ribs, a man crying into his glove, the sighing of a bent antenna as it loses an argument with gravity. At the edge of the bowl, a tall figure in a hooded cloak of ash-colored synth fiber lowers a long-limbed scope. They arrive with flensed quiet, the kind of precise hush that means everything they carry is expensive and consecrated. Their vox is clean, somehow immune to the shrieking in the air. Inquisitorial asset to orbit, the figure says, not hurried. Voice the temperature of coins. Mark this entity Gamma Prime. Recommend escalation to kill or capture per Ordo Xenos protocol. It exhibits non-compliant mass kinetics and unknown resistance to conventional arms. It may be psychically resonant. I taste copper. The figure pauses, picks a fleck of green stone from their lip. Correction. Everyone tastes copper. The creature wipes a smear of the cutter's soot from its face with the back of one hand and looks at the mark on its skin as if trying to remember what black is called. It frowns. It does not belong here. It does not belong anywhere it has been sent. The frown loads and clicks as if a shell just chambered. It lifts its head, and for the first time, not only sees the people on the ridge, but decides they are the reason it hurts. Something in the bowl groans. The planet again, unhappy that the bowl is now a launch pad. The creature steps in, and the ground remembers falling. It lopes toward the ridge, each stride eating more distance than the last. Its body is learning this world the way a fist learns a new face, rapidly, with results. Trag sees a shape coming that makes nonsense of training. She sees a shadow that arrives before the body. She has given hundreds of orders, some foolish, some brave. The one she gives now is very small and very human. Down, she says, and folds herself into the earth, and the squad becomes a handful of sinners trying to hide in gravel. A commissar arrives on the far side of the bowl with a coat like a flag and a hat like a threat. He stands on the hood of a still smoking crawler and opens his mouth to make a speech about courage as a duty. The creature's path flicks half a dozen boulders into the air like juggling balls. One of those boulders is the crawler's engine block, which decides to visit the commissar's speech at skull level. The speech terminates. The hat falls, lonely and proud. Back in the hive, children press their faces to broken windows. They will talk for years about the day the green thunder came. They will draw it in chalk until their knuckles gray. In the slums, opportunists sell vials of impact dust and blessed green. In the heights, someone places a bet on how long until the next prayer service includes the words, "Deliver us from the anger that walks." The Mechanicus priest does not run when the green shadow falls across him. He does the math again. He makes a little circle with his finger in the ash, as if maybe the circle will be more convincing this time. The creature's foot lands inches away, and rocks bound off his shins. He looks up and sees himself reflected a dozen times in one perfect, furious eye. The priest says sanctify, because it is the last word he can find that still means anything. The creature blinks, and the lid creaks like a fortress gate. The air around that eye is hot enough to wave. A beat. The priest raises a hand in greeting without understanding why. A hello offered to a god too new to recognize. The answer arrives without language. The next step breaks the last of the crater's lip and turns the slope into a slide. Bodies, armor, weapons, prayers. All of it begins to move, the world unbuttoned. The green thing rides the collapse like a wave, surfacing through grit and ruin, climbing as gravity tries and fails to reassert authority. It reaches the ridgeline, and the ridgeline ceases to exist as a coherent idea. Somewhere behind the ridge, a Lehman Russ engine coughs to life and settles into the brutal purr of readiness. The tank commander slaps his periscope into alignment and sees the horizon lift and become shoulders. He feels a hand on the back of his head, and it is his own, suddenly fascinated by the sensation of hair. He puts the hand back on the traverse grip. He does not want to die a poet. "Load high X," he says. His gunner's hands move, obedient, grateful for a job they know. The breech clunks. The round slides home with a satisfying industrial sigh. The commander licks a dry tooth. "On my mark." Dust clears in eddies. The green thing inhales, chest rising, and the tank's machine spirit recognizes an adversary that cannot be catalogued and stiffens out of pride. The tank's barrel lowers a hair. The commander opens his mouth. The thing moves, the ground answers, and metal answers, and men try to. The tank commander never got to finish the mark. The battle cannon spoke first. A word of steel the size of a coffin hurled at the chest of a walking contradiction. The round detonated with a flash that threw shadows like whips across the crater's rim. For an instant, everyone believed in physics again. The green giant bent, went away in the light and dust, and a cheer rose, ragged and disbelieving. He stepped out of the fire a heartbeat later, blackened, irritated, bigger. "Reload!" the commander snapped, voice breaking. The loader's hands found a fresh shell by muscle memory, older than fear. The turret barked again, recoil sleds slamming to the stops, breech spitting holy fumes into the crew's lungs. The second blast kicked the creature sideways across the lip of the bowl. He slid 15 meters, gouging a trench with one heel until the ground decided it was a wall again. "First rank, fire. Second rank, fire." Sergeant Tragg's order cut through 3 Vox channels at once. 2 firing lines of PDF and guard troopers rose out of the grit like a closing book. Lasguns stitched the air in red handwriting. Dozens of hits lit his torso and arms, a net of burn marks that should have written the end of a story. They wrote nothing. The burns went from bright to sullen to gone as skin closed like poured wax over a candle. A missile team got its act together. "Crack up!" A trooper kissed the purity seal on the tube and shouldered it. The missile bit into the green's flank and blew a dinner plate of flesh out into the dust. The trooper whooped once, involuntary, a childhood noise sneaking into a war. The hole snarled shut while he was exhaling, tendrils of muscle lacing themselves like angry rope. The trooper stared, forgot the second missile, then remembered everything at once and began to fumble. He reached the line in a 3-step blur, and the world decided to express what it thought about that with debris. A heavy bolter's roar chewed a string of impact flowers across his ribs. He grunted, put one hand on the heavy bolter's pintle mount as if steadying himself, and twisted. The weapon came away with the post came away with the ridge, and a corporal went away with his belief that metal is stronger than hands. "Sentinels forward!" Walking fire. On the right, 2 scout walkers clanked into view, knees like inverted triangles, multi-lasers lighting the dust. They raked him with accurate, disciplined beams. Their pilots were veterans, the kind of men who whispered to machine spirits as equals. The beams stung. He didn't like being stung. He took 3 long strides toward the left-hand walker, ducked under its fusillade with the speed of a bad thought, and shouldered it. The birdcage legs tangled, folded, and the sentinel sat down with a crunch of glass. The pilot got one arm out of the hatch. A green hand gentled him back in and folded the hatch like a letter. The demolisher came in heavy, element of a siege line that had been pretending not to be needed on a world that only fought bandits. Its stub nose tracked like a bulldog looking for a throat. The driver gunned it over the ridge, while the gunner sighted down a scope so scratched it saw 2 centuries. Trag could feel the gun's mass arrive in her teeth. The green thing turned, as if recognizing a worthy argument. "On," the commander began. The demolisher's cannon punched the sound out of the air. The round hit him square in the sternum, and the force of it taught the ground a new verb. He went away for a moment, became a smear and a crater, and then a silhouette inside an expanding ring of dirt. The crew inside the demolisher exhaled as one. "Hit! Center mass," the gunner whispered, as if telling a secret. The rim exploded. He came out roaring, ribs showing, and then not showing, bits of fused rock still embedded in green hide. He grabbed the demolisher's glacis plate with both hands and pushed as if shoving a door in a house that had said no to him too many times. Treads spun and found nothing. The machine spirit screamed through a dozen sensors at once. The tank slid backward, clawing its way into reverse like a drowning thing, until the creature squatted, got both heels into purchase, and heaved. The demolisher rolled, belly to the sun, the main gun yawning at the sky in terror. The crew inside turned into marbles in a jar. He slapped the underside once, insulted, and moved on. "Hellhounds, bring him flame!" A pair of Prometheum tanks slewed around a wrecked hab stack, dozer blades sparking on metal bones, their nozzles already burning blue-white. The first discharge washed over him in a moving wall of fire that bared every stress crack in the slag-like veins. The smell reached the lines, sweet and meat and accelerator, and men gagged behind filters. He kept walking through the inferno, skin blackening, droplets of burning promethium rolling off like molten hailstones. He grabbed the left hellhound's nozzle, which had never been grabbed by anything in its life, and squeezed. The pressure line ruptured 30 centimeters up, roaring a bouquet of liquid sun over the ground crews. The second hellhound's driver steered harder than he'd known a man could, sideswiping his own comrade to push the fire away from the infantry. The creature let the nozzle go, bored, and stepped through the flame as if it were weather. "Ogrins!" With me. A commissar who still had a voice led 3 abhumans forward, slabs of men with the joy of simple orders in their eyes. They carried ripper guns like handbags and opened up at 5 meters. Solid shot booming, kicked brass rolling in little fountains. The hits made him blink. He smiled for the first time, not happy, just amused that something had weight. An Ogrin, Basher Korg, lover of tin whistles and stew, lowered his gun and ran, arms wide, bellowing his mother's name. He got both arms around the green waist and squeezed. 18 heartbeats later, he was holding a boulder because the creature had stepped out of his grip and was somewhere else, lifting the commissar by his carapace collar to see if rules looked different up close. The commissar met the gaze with the discipline that had propped up 100 broken lines. He tried to raise his bolt pistol. The hand holding him tightened, as a child might pinch a frog to see what it would do. The pistol fell. The commissar decided to die with a sentence, and made it to buy the... before the hand was empty, and he was part of the ridge. Far to the rear, basilisk barrels had been ticking west by degrees, told to wait, told to be patient. the order broke. The Earthshakers slammed, 3 hammer blows on the world's skull. The first round went long, raising a mountain out of dust beyond him. The second came short, scooping trenches out of the slope and erasing a half platoon who had chosen their cover too reasonably. The third found the middle, a raw, hot sphere of pressure that tried to convince his bones they had always wanted to be air. He staggered. Men whooped. Trug didn't. She was counting gaps and casualties, and the arithmetic was personal. "Keep the line," she yelled, and was grateful that her throat still worked. "Keep him under." Valkyries skimmed the ridge, angels with rivets, multi-lasers whining, rocket pods barking in pairs. One kite banked so low its wingtip kissed a rust stub and came away smoking. Hotshot squads slid down rappels in sheets of dust and courage, boots hitting grit as synchronized as a prayer. Tempestus scions moved like a single hand, melters forward, volley on the beat. "Burn him," their Tempestus snapped, and 4 multi-melters sang. The air around the beams wrinkled like paper over a candle. The shots painted circles of uncolor into his hide. He screamed, an animal, the first real pain they'd wrung out of him, arms up as if to swat wasps. A scion closed to point blank and pressed the muzzle into green flesh. His finger tightened. The weapon coughed, a hiccup, and the fusion wash cut a hole the size of a helm through him. It closed around the scion's hand. The scion let go of his gun and tried to pull back. The gun's sling caught under his pauldron, and he learned what a vice felt like. 2 brothers hauled him backward by the harness, and the 3 of them went down in a tangle as the green hand swept where their heads had been. "Maintain spacing." Trug's vox was all edges. "Do not bunch." "Do not." He seized a Valkyrie by the troop bay frame as it flared for a second pass, fingers denting adamantium as if it were bread. The pilot dumped throttle, and blessed ignorance held the fuselage a heartbeat longer than fingers should have allowed. The gunner saw the world rotate and then explode into ground. A wing carved a trench through men and rocks and prayers, then flopped into final stillness with the mechanical dignity of a dead bird. The second Valkyrie hauled up and away, pilot sobbing breathless apologies to a machine angel that would never forgive the angle he'd chosen. "Artillery, keep him moving!" A forward observer had climbed a broken comms mast to see over the dust and was still there because fear and duty were wrestling, and duty had him by the throat. He read out corrections with the calm of a man inventorying his own pockets. Earthshakers rumbled again, staggered, pounded, drummed, an ugly symphony that taught men to count without numbers. Each blast pushed the creature, buffeted him like waves. He learned in real time the rhythm of falling steel. He began to move between impacts, to be elsewhere when the ground tore up to meet him. He used craters as stepping stones. He met a running chimera with an absent-minded kick and sent it end over end into a supply truck, whose contents became a brief comet of rations and boots. A command chimera slewed sideways, hatch slamming open, its interior a contrail of incense and field maps. Inside, a colonel with a face like a knife pointed at a blinking cogitator slate and spoke as if steadiness could be contagious. "Hold him short of Vardek's curtain wall. We cannot have him punching a hole. Authorizations pending for ordnance heavier than your imaginations. You will not break." "Sir," an aide began, throat dry. "Message from orbit. Exterminatus protocols require inquisitorial sign and dual navy concurrence. Ordo Xenos representative is listening." Over the company net, a cold voice spoke like winter in a vault. "You will not sterilize this world while I can still write orders. You will fix the entity in place. You will live long enough for me to arrive." The channel closed without the courtesy of a click. "Understood," the colonel said to no one who could help. He grabbed the Vox. "All units, we trade ground for time. Draw him east. Give the guns an honest target. Basilisks, you will fire until your breeches glow. Valkyries, switch to saturation rockets. Scions, displace in bounds. Do not go noble." Men moved not because the plan would work, but because plans had gotten them this far in life, and abandoning the habit now would feel like blasphemy. A line of catacans, few, hard, ghosted up a drainage cut and set satchel charges with the indifferent professionalism of men who knew jungle, city or hell were all just words for places with enemies. A Krieger sapper team dug in the unground, faces impassive behind death masks, and planted posts that they wired with a web of conductive hatred. The posts crackled to life, a hedgehog of grav chains humming at a frequency that made teeth itch. He hit the web by accident, and then on purpose. The chains wrapped him like hungry smoke. They did not cease to be physics under his hands, because they had never been physics to begin with, but stubbornness crafted by priests and engineers, and the fear of failure. He leaned. The posts moaned. The web held. A dozen hearts leapt in a dozen chests. Trag suddenly realized she was halfway up out of cover, knife in hand again, like an idiot. "Bring the Russes," she yelled, voice ripping. "While he's held, bring dash dash." He took a breath so large the skins of men pricked in sympathy. He pulled, not with arms, not only, but with the memory of every time a door had stayed shut, and every time he had made it admit it was only wood. The posts came up out of the ground in unison, roots snapping like vertebrae. He wore the web for a few steps like a cape, and then tore it from himself in a glittering shrug that turned a squad into a constellation of cuts. A Lehman Russ rumbled into a hull-down posture and belched a battle cannon shell into the middle of that glitter. The round punched him sideways into a heap of wreckage where a promethium can ruptured and a new sun was briefly born. Trag didn't waste the second. "Left files forward, right files cover. Melter guns on me." They sprinted like condemned men, running to be first at the rope. A pair of melters got within 10 paces and let go. Flesh bubbled and flowed like fat in a pan. The stink scribbled itself into memory. Hot blood, solvents, cinder. He came out of the fire, low, fast, childish, and swatted the first gunner flat with an open hand. The second gunner forgot the trigger and remembered it when there was only air where a target had been. "Medici!" Med. The rest of the word didn't matter. The Medici knew their lines and were already there, hauling, patching, pushing men back together by force of habit and staples. A Ministorum priest mounted a rock that used to be a wall and raised a book that had survived 4 worlds. He tried a hymn. His voice shook at the edges and then found a core, and the words climbed out of him like ladders. Troopers straightened without decision. The book made a small, brave square between fear and the next second. He came for the priest without meaning to. Rage isn't a hunter, it's weather. A bullgrin stepped into it, slab shield braced, helm low. The shield rang like a ship's bell when the fist hit it. The bullgrin dug heels, slid meters, spat once, grinned, and held. The second hit lifted him and shield both into a longer story than he had intended to tell with his life. "Mortars?" asked someone with hope as thin as paper. "Spent," said the someone who counted. The basilisks did not stop. Their crews were stripped to the waist, arms glittering with grit and oil, prayers flaking off lips as they slammed shell after shell into breaches hot enough to curl hair. Servo skulls wept machine incense. One barrel coughed a gout of white and seized. 2 tech adepts swarmed it with tools that had known 5 generations of the same family's touch, and coaxed another cycle from it with kind words and carbon rods. A fresh wave of rockets came in from the remaining Valkyries, streaks that stitched the world together with brief, brutal thread. The green thing finally gave ground in the direction they'd wanted from the start, not routed, nothing so sane, but harried and harassed into an angle he hadn't chosen. They herded a storm with batons, painfully, impossibly. He stepped back into a soft spot in the wastes, where centuries of ash had gathered over voided culverts and cooling tunnels. His heel sank. He felt something like indignation at the planet for being sneaky, and that indignation translated into a long, furious bound out and away, east toward slag hills and manufactorum canyons where sight lines were short and ambushes long. "Do not pursue into the stacks," the cold voice on the net said, returning like a frost. "You will not find him. You will be found. Fix your lines. Mark the ground with saint candles. I am inbound." "Mark the ground with what?" someone muttered, then bent to plant a flare in the churned earth anyway. They stood among noise that was learning how to be silence again. The wind remembered how to be wind, not just shrapnel delivery. Troopers dragged the living and the dead into zones they'd agreed about without ever meeting. A loader from the demolisher crawled out from under a track that no longer had a right to be on top of him and started laughing softly until a medici told him he wasn't allowed to. Trug wiped grit out of her mouth with the back of a glove, tasted iron and old batteries, and checked her people by name. She found too many quiet answers. She kept going anyway because counting the living is a task you can finish even if the numbers hate you. High above, the hive's curtain walls glowed in the afternoon like a row of teeth. Somewhere in the deep, cogitators updated a threat log. A junior scribe added a cautious skull icon, and a saint's statue put another crack on a list no one kept. Far out in the east, among towers of rust and the skeletons of forgotten machines, something green moved with a gait that was not a retreat exactly. The ground, bruised and offended, waited for the next argument. The guard, who had been arguing with worlds since they left home, set their feet in the half-light and reloaded. The thunder that followed him east was not weather, but will. Guns testing their own faith, men proving that orders could be louder than fear. When it thinned to cautious distance and the wastes stopped ringing, other footsteps arrived, quieter, heavier, older. A lean gunship cut the sky without contrails, its matte hull drinking light. It came in dirty and flat, stamped with sanction seals and the kind of serials that meant records lived behind locked doors. It kissed the ground on gravitics, ramp already yawning. A figure in ash grey stepped out, cloak sewn with vox scramblers and dust. Their rosette flashed once and then hid again like a knife put away out of politeness. 2 stormtroopers flanked the Inquisitor the way cliffs flank a river. Present, inevitable, deliberately uninteresting. "Perimeter," the Inquisitor said, not raising their voice. The troopers moved. Servitors trundled down with sensor masts blossoming like steel flowers. Tiny skull drones lifted and fanned out, trailing faint incense as if apologizing to the air. The rosette flickered against the ramp's shade. "Ordo Xenos authority assumed," the Inquisitor added into the open band, and every officer in 3 kilometers had to consciously unclench teeth and accept it. A designation has been issued. Gamma Prime. We will not repeat errors. We will measure the thing before we name it a fate. They tasted copper too, but didn't say it. They touched the scope to their eye, its reticule blooming with sigils gifted by a psyker they had outlived. In the Manufactorum canyons, heat pools showed like bruises. Something big moved, patient again. Rage was patient, it turned out. It could wait if there would be more to lift later. The Inquisitor's Auspex sang a discreet tone. Blue-coded inbound. A second shadow rolled over the dust, a much larger presence shouldering physics aside with the confidence of a legend that has deserved itself. The drop craft wore the livery of no single world and every crusade. Matte ceramite, caution stripes like old scars, a purity seal pressed with an iron that had once been a saint's finger. It didn't so much land as declare that this spot now qualified. The ramp slammed open. They came out like executioners arriving late to a riot and not apologizing. Giants in black plate, chapter kneeling with the Ordo's watch sigil welded over older heraldry. Death Watch. 5 at first. Always enough. Never all of them at once. Helm lenses iced. The clunk of maglocks set the cadence for hearts around them. Their sergeant's right pauldron still bore the faint ghost of crimson wings under the silvered skull, as if the old paint refused to forget. His voice had the unlikely softness of a man who had learned to be gentle with sacred machines, so he could ask them for uglier things. Situation. The Inquisitor nodded toward the east. A non-compliant mass kinetic hostile with regenerative capacity and resistance to sane weaponry. Motility extreme. Warp resonance unknown. It hurt when we shot it. It minded being burned. It got better. Good, the sergeant said. He meant it. He turned to his kill team. A salamander with a melter gun the size of a promise. A fist with a grav cannon, calm as masonry. A raven guard with a stalker pattern bolter and the manner of a shadow that wanted to be left alone. A space wolf with a chain fist and a grin like a saw. A librarian whose eyes were winter glass. Kraken and vengeance, the sergeant said. Grav for muscle. Melter for indignation. Interdict, not annihilate. The master of the watch wants it alive as a problem we can pose to other problems. Alive, the wolf echoed cheerfully, as if alive was a game he enjoyed playing with nouns. Behind them, the dropcraft's belly groaned, and something heavier answered gravity with contempt. A walking shrine took the ramp in 2 clanking steps. A dreadnought in black and iron. Sarcophagus etched with the names of men who had died with their hands to the work. Its power fist flexed, a metal basilisk deciding on a smile. The pilot's voice bled through the hull vox, old and harsh, and surprised to still be interested. What is it called? Gamma Prime, the sergeant said. It will have a better name, the dreadnought replied, and stirred the dust. Other banners gathered, drawn not by signals but by the kind of gravity that arranges hierarchies for you. The Mechanicus arrived as a tide of legs and liturgies, Scitarii in lines like machine-written text, rangers with lenses instead of eyes and points of light where thoughts would be. Onager dune crawlers trundled out of a convoy like beetles that had learned artillery. A dominus rose from the heart of it on piston stilts. The cowl of a cathedral hung over a spider of limbs. Incense spoons rippled over a furred cloak of prayer threads. The dominus greeted the dust. calming it, then greeted the Inquisitor with a nod that acknowledged jurisdiction and regretted impediments to science. Magos Biologus Principal Hecater Lo, the Dominus announced via Vox, and threw a whispering cord into the noosphere for anyone with the implants to hear. I would have this specimen. Consent is a ritual. I respect rituals. But my faith is hunger, and I cannot promise to wait. Your faith is recorded, the Inquisitor said. So is mine. They didn't bristle. Mechanicus don't bristle. They increase fan speed. Elsewhere, a rhino cut a dusty path and turned to show a symbol men involuntarily buckled their shoulders at. A single three-headed aquila in gold, not painted, woven into the plate. Custodian? No. The angle was wrong, the restraint too human. A small detachment in auric-hued plate that was not auramite but had tried. Palatine wardens, the Inquisitor's private bulwark, or something like them. Their presence said that if arguments escalated beyond words, the Inquisitor would still make the next decisions. Do you plan to talk to it? The librarian asked quietly. His voice was careful with the edges of the idea. If it can be spoken to, the Inquisitor said. If it understands that its choice is to become interesting on a table or useful in a war. The librarian breathed in, held the world in his chest for a beat, and tasted metallic. It feels like a storm that does not have a sky to be in. I do not think it will answer with words. Then we'll speak in demonstrations, the Death Watch sergeant said, setting his helm. We will show it, we can sit it down. The first demonstration was geography. The Mechanicus unfurled a stasis scaffold like a spider laying out a theater. Pylons stabbing into the ash, tuning coils rising, data tethers humming, servitors anchoring cables with motions as plural as an insect colony. Electro-priests in ragged cowls whispered to the static until it came willingly to their fingers. They arced it down into grounding rods that sang like angry flutes. Castellan robots, redoubtably ridiculous and then suddenly terrible, plodded into positions where their phosphor blasters could draw boxes in air. A manipulus stood at the web's center, feeding power into the lattice from a generator harness that had cost 200 pilgrim lives to obtain and 3 to sanctify. Localized chronal inertia, Magos Lo murmured, which was how they said please. A kindness to an angry animal. We will not hurt it. We will hold it still long enough for our eyes to catch up. Do your eyes include a neutron laser? The Death Watch fist asked dryly, patting the Onega's turret. Observation sometimes requires clarity, the Magos replied, which was how they said yes without working the jaw. The second demonstration fell from orbit. The Death Watch had called an Astartes company not to obey, but to court the right kind of disobedience. A spearhead from a chapter, whose blue had been darkened by campaign grime, rolled out like a prayer that had grown armor. A captain disembarked with the stillness of a leader who had never argued with his own soul and won. His guard fanned. Blade brothers in cataphracti plate, a contemptor whose spirit had once laughed, now carefully not remembering how. Captain, the Inquisitor said, acknowledging a sovereign who had chosen to attend rather than be summoned. Inquisitor, the captain returned. It has blood? Yes. Then we can speak to it. He drew his relic blade, and the air around the edge behaved as if it had learned better manners. He did not posture. He looked east and felt muscles he'd been given by the Emperor, and others given by 1,000 hours of self-betrayal called training, prepare themselves. The Inquisitor sketched the shape of the plan with words that understood risk as religion. We bait it to the scaffold. The Death Watch test mass with gravity. Mechanicus set hooks into time. Astartes do not rush until it is slowed. I will decide if life continues to be the goal. They went out into the Manufactorum canyons with the kind of stealth that only giants can manage. Boldly, as if owning the noise prevents ambush. The place had once been a mouth that ate rock and breathed flame. Now it was a throat cleared to silence. Soot stuck to even the careful. Rust held its breath, listening for thunder. The Raven Guard took point, and then seemed not to. His vox ghosted through the net like a rumor told by walls. Movement. Green. Not moving like a hunted thing. Moving like a memory that just remembered a door. They let him pass them in a curve, a bow drawn wide. Scions with melter pins forward. Astartes, heavy weapons sunk into cover that would survive a second's fury and not a third. Skitarii marking ranges with slivers of light that only they believed in. Above, skulls orbited in polite circles, lightning arresters in case the warp remembered to make itself relevant. He came down an avenue grown from cranes and skeleton rails, shoulders bruising the air. His gait was heavy, and then not. He flowed around a fallen loader, like water remembering stone. He saw them and chose the largest shape to talk to first. The Contemptor stepped out and turned the street into a duel. The old warrior took the first hit, like a man receiving a greeting from an old friend he had not wanted to see again. The fist on his chest rang like bell metal. Warning runes flickered, come as a stage whisper. He responded with a backhand whose design had survived 10,000 years of war, because physics liked it. The green shape rolled, planted a palm, and was up in a way that mocked how mass is supposed to sulk. Grav, the Death Watch sergeant said quietly, and the fist depressed the rune. The cannon's growl deepened into an inevitability. Space thickened around the thing's legs. Knees found weight that hadn't been there. The thing slowed as if the air had chosen to get clingy. Now, Magos Lo breathed, and the scaffold lived. The pylons sang a triad that scraped the sky. The coils bloomed in ghost light. A curtain of inverted shimmer draped the street from end to end, like a rain you could only feel with your skeleton. The creature hit it like a dog hits a glass door. Expectation broken by a thing invented by people who had learned to hate failure more than fear. The stasis ribbon stuck to green hide and made a decision. You are here. There was a moment. It unfolded like paper. The Death Watch advanced in it as if it were a garden path. The salamander placed his melter gun on the creature's shoulder as reverently as a priest placing a candle, and pressed the trigger. Flesh buckled and tried to comb itself through a hole the size of a shield. It failed and sulked closed in an uglier pattern. The librarian's voice poured low syllables into the street, conjuring a chain that smelled like rain on iron. It wrapped the creature's chest, and while it was wrapped, the captain stepped in. He did not waste words. He made one cut, low and precise, across a hamstring the size of a hab door. The blade spoke in a dialect of light and tradition. For a second, that leg forgot to exist, and the creature knelt without anyone commanding it. Hold, the librarian warned, sweat starting under his gorget. It hates. It hates like a cathedral of red bells. The chain faltered, flared, held. Copper taste thickened. The Inquisitor made note of the way the world tilted around the green mass and filed it next to other dangerous tilts. Skitarii Rangers bracketed kneecaps with galvanic fire meant to argue standards into compliance. Onagers lanced clean white through ribs, punching neat tunnels that hissed and sealed. Castellans painted blinding phosphor across eyes and open wounds, because sometimes blindness is mercy, and sometimes it's measurement. The Manipulus grinned involuntarily when a readout plateaued. "It is obeying," they whispered, shocked delight doing something human to their click voice. "The numbers are..." The chain snapped. The librarian's warding syllable turned into a swear. As reality remembered, it was allowed to be a disappointment. The creature tore one arm out of the molasses of stasis like a bear wrenching free of a trap, skin smoking with borrowed chronal burn. The arm came across in an angry arc. The salamander's melter gun ceased to exist where it mattered. So did 2 inches of black ceramite along a pauldron. The Astartes behind the melter gun didn't scream. He swore his oath of moment out loud, as if that would remind his bones which way to fall. "Rebind!" Margos Low snapped, and electro-priests plunged their hands into lightning and then into the net as if baptizing themselves in their god's temper. Coils spat, pylons flexed. One exploded in a petulant spray of parts that decided their careers were over. The net did not so much tighten as become offended. The captain caught the next swing on the relic blade and discovered that even a relic can be a lever used against you. The impact shoved him back 3 steps, each footfall cracking stone as if the street had turned into thin ice. He found his balance on the 4th and slid in again, edge angling for tendons, not glory. He was rewarded with a roar and a spatter of hot black that hissed where it flecked his greave. The dreadnought grabbed the creature around the waist like a house deciding to embrace a hurricane. Pistons screamed an old song. "Down," the sarcophagus voice advised, intimate as a secret. "Down!" It almost worked. For a beat that would be told later as a miracle, the green mass went still. Stasis and grav and stubbornness and 10,000 kilograms of dead hero all in agreement. The Inquisitor raised a hand, and the custodian, not custodians, lowered launchers heavy with null lattice. "Do not break it," the Inquisitor said. "Do not break it." The Mechanicus had learned how to be precise, even when precision went missing. A cadre of Cataphron destroyers rolled forward and did not fire heavy grav like a bludgeon, but as the last careful tap to a nail already seated. A hummed tone, tuned to the human lie they had convinced the machine to sing. The creature's chest hit the ground. Dust jumped in a circle around it. Grateful and surprised, men exhaled as a choir. It took that breath away by head-butting the street. The shock made the scaffold hiccup. The chrono-lattice burped. The not custodian's launcher missed a microsecond, and the null payload slopped out of reality like jelly thrown at an open door. It splashed. It should have splashed inside. It didn't. "That's not how it was going to go," the Manipulus said softly, and looked personally betrayed by time. The creature found the dreadnought's arm and bent it with the simple honesty of a man straightening a horseshoe. Ceramite groaned, cracked, yielded. The old warrior laughed once, hoarse and delighted, the sound of someone who had been bored and now was not. He pivoted his assault cannon in close and stitched a belt of hatred into a cheek. Teeth, too many, glittered in the spray. The creature spat them out, new ones marching in behind like recruits. The Deathwatch sergeant planted his boot on a collarbone and fired Kraken rounds into the seam, where neck met weight. Each shot punched in, detonated, argued. He did not stop to see if the argument had been won. He was a man who had learned what "until empty" means. "Again," the captain said to his own legs, which had decided to hesitate. The relic blade flashed. An ear, argumentative, unnecessary, left the conversation. He ducked. The world filled with the noise of a fist missing him by a hair and killing a crane by accident. "Withdraw 2 paces, the Inquisitor said, not to make the lines prettier, but because the serrated string in their palm had thrummed a warning that they had learned to respect. The void tasted like pennies. The librarian gagged and then swore because gagging in front of brothers felt rude. He felt the warp lean in like a drunk at a bar, interested for all the wrong reasons. The Mechanicus announced regret the way storms announce themselves on barometers. Overpower risk exceeds chassis tolerances. We can hold for 3. 2. 1 dash dash. The scaffold poured power it did not have, borrowed futures it did not own, and then failed cleanly. Coils dimming like dying stars, pylons bowing with relief. The creature stood into the absence of resistance like a man straightening a back that had carried a beam too long. He was bleeding. He was bigger. He was angrier in a way that had texture to it now, edges like torn metal. The captain set his stance again, and the lines of his armor looked tired. The Death Watch reloaded as casually as men fishing, flick flick, magazine, bolt, the kind of habit that outlives fear. The Dominus leaned forward, limb forest quivering, every mechadendrite trembling toward the green like a plant to sun. "Again," Magos Lo said, somewhere between worship and work. "Again, and closer." "Negative," the Inquisitor said, and it wasn't a command so much as a promise that something worse than being denied would happen if they ignored it. Their gaze tracked the green shape as it chose a direction that wasn't exactly escape. It was the kind of movement a problem makes when it decides to be somewhere slightly more difficult to love. "Follow," the captain said. "No," the Inquisitor countered. "Walk him. He will not be run down. He will choose ground that makes you small and makes him happy. We will not give him that. We will leave a path, and we will close it behind him, and we will make the only door the one we own." The librarian's voice, small in all the static, added, "And there is something watching that would like to see us hurry." The green thing shouldered through a wall that had once held up 100 years of machines and now decided it had done enough. He left a print of himself in the dust like a cave painting drawn by a giant. The dreadnought flexed his injured arm and found it confessed less than it had suffered. The old warrior took a step, found the ground under him agreeable again, and spoke through Vox in a tone that forgave and promised at once. "It is very strong," he said, the way a hunter might say a stag was proud. "Good," the captain replied, haircut neat even in dust, blade lowered. "Then it might understand honor." The Mechanicus began quietly folding a new web in a new place with the kind of speed that used to belong to miracles. The Death Watch ghosted into shadows they weighed before they entered. The Inquisitor looked down at their palm where the skin had learned to taste warp, and then looked up where clouds pretended to be only clouds. "Gamma Prime," they said into the general band, voice clipped and low. "Addendum, it learns. It despises being still. It may fear it. It will break where the world insists on quiet. Bring me that kind of place." The Vox acknowledged in 3 languages and 2 songs. Somewhere behind them, basilica bells muttered unintentionally as cooling barrels shrank. Somewhere ahead, in the stacked gorges of a dead city for machines, green knuckles brushed past a pilgrim's forgotten ribbon and turned it briefly into fire. It started like tinnitus in the soul, a pressure behind the eyes of anyone who had ever skimmed the surface of the immaterium and come back sane. Choirs across the subsector faltered in the same bar of the same hymn without knowing why. Astropaths slumped on their thrones and let red thread run from their noses as if the song had become too loud to sit through. Navigators on a convoy bound for distant forges blinked their third eyes shut on instinct and found the warp looking back anyway, curious, amused, hungry the way a thunderhead is hungry for hills. Librarians felt it first as a note that didn't belong to an instrument, a single, sustained frequency like a finger around the rim of a chalice swelling in air. No words, no will, just pressure. The Deathwatch psyker dragged a gloved thumb along the warding runes on his gorget and let breath out in a hiss he had earned the right to call a prayer. "It is not a psyker," he said, tasting the lie in the truth. "It is a stone dropped into an ocean that only cares about storm." The warp, which is a habit of minds to make weather from thoughts, paid attention. Somewhere scarlet, where the ground is knives and the sky is rules nailed to bones, a brass citadel paused mid-war and cocked its head. The weight of 1 billion murders leaned on a railing. The idea of a grin without lips rose like heat over iron. Pure wrath, uncomplicated, unadorned, not bought with sorcery, but born in sinew and refusal. One of Khorne's hounds lifted its muzzle and howled through a throat that had been a trumpet once. The sound crossed no distance because distance is a lie in places like that. Elsewhere, everywhere, plans paused, reconsidered, took notes. A palace full of feathers shuffled its libraries and found it did not have a file for a world where a single man contained 2 incompatible futures and only rage was allowed to decide which one arrived. Quills skittered like insects over vellum, as Tzinch's scribes wrote the same name twice and argued about whether it should be the same name. Far in a garden of rot, a grandfather patted his belly and chuckled at the honesty of healing that came without permission. Spores drifted toward the idea of a wound that would not stay open long enough to make family. Slaanesh craned from a couch made of compliments and went back to sleep. There were more exquisite sins than this. On the ground, the Inquisitor rubbed the pad of their thumb along the hair-thin scar on their palm that had taught them when storms click their tongues. The copper taste was a penny under every tongue now. The air around the Manufactorum canyons turned thin and bright, the way air does when a storm is deciding on a map. "Null assets," the Inquisitor said, and the Vox cross-talked itself quiet. "I want them in my shadow before the warp learns to sing along." The gunship that arrived wore black that swallowed light rather than reflected it, and the skull-faced helm that stepped down first made even veterans look away, because looking felt like stepping too near a cliff you couldn't see. A Culexus assassin walks like a thirst. The anima, that hateful presence that is more absence than thing, pushed at the world and made it cagey. Around the pariah, the air dulled, the static in teeth cut out. The librarian flinched like someone had pulled a bandage off the inside of his skull. 2 more followed, smaller in frame but heavier in effect, moving in lozenge formation with an ease that made squads of drilled soldiers look like street mobs. The Sisters of Silence didn't announce themselves. The emptiness did it for them. They wore ash-grey plate that reflected nothing of the world, and bore no text because words wither under their gaze. Their blades were clean, their faces unreadable behind visors polished until they could have been windows into a night with no stars. The silence arrived like rain. Men breathed easier without knowing why. The vox, paradoxically, clarified. The librarian took a step away because his thoughts fought him when a silent approached. Candle flame near an open door. "Hold the line of them at my mark," the Inquisitor instructed. "Between us and the thing. We are not weakening it. We are muffling a choir we did not hire." The first demonic probe manifested where blood had a chance to reflect a sky that wasn't there. It began as a heat shimmer and decided to be an outline with knives. A fleshhound's brass collar pushed through air like a coin through milk. Red feet without grace skidded in ash and scored it like pottery. The null's presence hit it like a dropped pane of cold. Steam rose from a thing that was not made of water. The hound's eyes bled witchfire that behaved shamefacedly as heat, and then its head snapped toward the new green animal approaching like a storm pushed by a man. He didn't see the collar. He saw the throats of the soldiers the hound would find. He ripped a beam out of an old crane with a sound like lightning, thinking better of it, and swung it end over end. The hound leapt. The beam caught the collar and flexed. Sparks shot out like thrown coins. The beast screamed in a voice that turns inscriptions to rust and hit the ground sideways amid its own fury. He was on it, not understanding the thing's story, not caring. The first punch flattened a face that had never accepted the idea of being hit. The second pulped reality around bone. The third found purchase on metaphors. The collar split like an oath keeps failing to, and the hound boiled away with a howl that sounded like a forge changing its mind. Horn did not pout. Horn does not pout. The blood god approved the argument as only a god of arguments can. Laughter that is percussion in places where percussion becomes continents. A slender change in the storm's pitch implied permission to send more. He did not. He waited. He is patient when the knife has found a whetstone. Librarian, personal cant. The pressure climbs when it notices opposition. It loves being opposed. The least helpful thing we can do is give it pure lines to push against. "You're describing Khorne," the sergeant said. "No," the librarian said, and swallowed something copper. "I'm describing the warp. Khorne is a symptom. This is the fever." The sentient answer was not a beast, but a picture. Heat fluttered. Light misremembered itself. The green titan paused, brow twitching. A man in torn purple, small in the way prey are small, looked up from under a weight of guilt you could build stairs out of. The name caught in the giant's throat like a fishbone. Banner. The outline held for one slow breath. Someone far away, covered in feathers and futures, smiled like a mirror teaching another mirror how to lie. The gnolls walked forward as one, and the world forgot. How to hold memories that didn't want to be shared. The illusion deflated into heat and never happened. The giant's face did something complicated and then boiled down to anger because there was always room for that. The librarian shuddered like a man stepping out of a cold river. He wiped his mouth. His hand came away clean, but he looked at it as if expecting it not to be. "Do not let it have a story," the Inquisitor said quietly. "Stories are where gods live." The Mechanicus recorded it all in script that made whirring prayers of numbers. Their noospheric chatter was a library of exclamations. A tech adept with augmetics, where sympathy should be murmured, delighted and appalled, peaks at 8, 9. Margos, we are logging an Angor decibel signature I would charitably call cathedral scale. A chant of data spilled into the net. Amplitude, frequency, the strange way the storm never quite centered on the giant, and yet followed him as faithfully as a shadow. The Dominus stroked a suspended coil and crooned, not a psyker, a resonator, a drum we did not know we had in an orchestra that never runs out of hammers. Make me a lattice that hates music, the Inquisitor answered, and keep your electro-priests away from the sisters unless you want to watch two religions bury each other in the same grave. The Sisters of Silence moved up in a staggered screen, the way surfers might arrange themselves around a breaking wave, their auras overlapping in a geometry designed by sadists who loved soldiers. At the overlap, thought thinned to a manageable murmur. Within that hush, librarian wards held longer than they had any right to. The Astartes psyker raised a hand and drew a sigil that linked 3 disappointments into a promise. Threads of force crisscrossed the avenue and settled on green hide like spider silk spun from good intentions. Force, he breathed, and his blade woke with light that had been negotiated from a cosmos with no reason to be kind. He darted in, uncharacteristically human compared to what towered over him, and struck where ligaments showed white. The blade bit. It bit the way climate bites, slowly, and then all at once. He felt the wound be deep because meaning helped it be deep. The creature flinched, not from fear, but from being told no by something it couldn't put its hands on. He tried to twist the blade and found his wrists snapped sideways by a hand that disapproved of language it couldn't lift. He cartwheeled, landed on knees that remembered training, and wheezed once. The nearest sister stepped closer on instinct, and his thoughts turned to moths slapping a porch lamp until it went dark. He staggered back, nodded thanks he couldn't say, and used a wall to stand like a friend with bad timing. Culexus field hum rose, animus speculum yawning open like a camera that eats light instead of recording it. A filament of draft pulled at things that should not be pulled. Daemon forged echoes, whispers that had nearly coalesced into claws. Where the Culexus looked, the warp forgot how to happen. Where the Culexus stood, bloodletters tried to remember if they had knees and failed. The pariah didn't need to swagger. The void swaggered on his behalf. The assassin's presence didn't soften muscle or slow hands. The Green Titan's rage did not find less fuel. It simply found fewer matches. He seemed annoyed by the quiet, baffled that the biting music had clipped. He tried to stomp the silence and found it was everywhere it wanted to be. He fell back on certainty, lifting, breaking, throwing, pushing, all verbs that the warp respects by staying out of the way. In a shrine level 200 floors up, a cult that had been waiting for a sign decided this was it and spilled a bowl of blood into a circle they'd drawn wrong. A red shape unfolded itself out of the spill, like a man getting out of a cloak he didn't want to own. It took one step into a world that tasted of rust and industry, and then met a field of absence rolling up the stair like dawn through a door. The shape thinned, snarled a threat in a grammar that frightened light, and blew apart into confetti that turned to dust, that turned to regret. A grey night might have been perfect here, but perfection is a scarce resource that arrives on its own schedule, and the Inquisitor was not of the order that calls them with a name. They settled for choreography. They laid out nulls like stepping stones. They fed power into sanctified copper coils until heat demons drifted off them like perfume. They walked the green thing toward an intersection that their maps named with numbers and their guts named with relics. 4 pylons sunk deep into bedrock, a cathedral of ironwork around a spill of ancient sacred soil that had been swallowed by the Manufactorum before history grew teeth. There, the warp was thinner for reasons that had nothing to do with science and everything to do with habit. Pilgrims had once knelt there. Prayers had worn a channel through reality with their knees. The librarian felt his wards expand the way lungs do in mountain air. The Culexus felt his hunger become fat and dull, almost satisfied. The sisters took one more step forward, and the air went black and soft like velvet over a grave. "Here," the Inquisitor said softly. "We end a sentence or start a new clause." It didn't want to be quiet. The creature felt the hush and went to war with it the way a drunk goes to war with closing time, every motion a complaint. He flung the skeleton of a loader tower at the line, and the pariah's presence erased the small demons that had already climbed onto it to pull its shadow into teeth. He bellowed through a throat that had learned the word enough from a city that never stopped asking. Horn watched from somewhere that is not direction and felt delight that tasted like iron. The notion of a chain, heavy with brass links, lifted itself invisibly and lowered in test above the giant, measuring neck, measuring will. The librarian hissed and pressed wards until his eyes watered. The sisters' formation drifted half a pace inward, knives glimmering in any light that dared cross that air, and the chain flinched from a hole that could not be filled. The captain stepped into the world where the hush pared noise to an edge, and his relic blade for once felt purely like metal, made honest by craft. Not a word spoken for it by a god. "Down," he said, with a patience born from a lifetime of killing things, as if it were a form of courtesy. The Death Watch sergeant to his left fired a Kraken round into the knee to remind the universe about leverage. The dreadnought, limping but pleased, set his heel the way a mountain sets weather, and embraced the green waste with the affection of a siege. The stun lasted longer. They were learning the language of quiet. The stasis lattice, rebuilt, simpler, humbler, clicked on with a si rather than a scream. It held not because it was stronger, but because fewer things were trying to tell the story at once. The storm shuddered. The warp grumbled and went to get a drink. Daemons, deprived of instruments, sulked in the wings. Even Tzench's attention wandered. The mirror trick had been spoiled, and new lies asked to be born elsewhere. He trembled like a bow pulled past the notch. The rage had nowhere to reflect, nowhere to pick up harmonics that made it sing. It became work. He worked. He pushed. He dug heels into basalt and made the basalt think about being sand. The captain's blade dipped, rose, nicked hamstring again, channeled respectful force into a living problem. The librarian said a word he was not supposed to say out loud, and it bent gravity like a knee. The Inquisitor held up a palm, and the sisters shifted their geometry half a pace, and the quiet grew teeth. On a far craft world that did not care to be named by Mon Kerr, a far-seer threw the bones and watched green wedge through red gate and wondered which god would be angrier if she intervened. The runes skittered, laughed at the idea that a future exists that is not barbed, and told her nothing useful. She put the bones away and went to tell the autarch that some storms you sail around. Beneath the volcano of a hive's foundation, black ships turned slightly on their cold courses, as if coming a degree off a headwind. Their holds groaned with freight nobody writes songs about. Their navigators noted the new bright bruise in the map and wrote in margins, "Go around, do not stare. A storm can learn. A fist can become a lever." Quiet is a kind of weapon nobody wants to admit because it feels like surrender. The line held. The ground listened. The warp, annoyed at being kept from a spectacle, pressed its face to the glass and fogged it and drew a symbol on the fog with a bloody nail and laughed to itself and waited. They came like laughter with teeth, engines coughing smoke the color of bruises, ramshackle banners clattering like fortune-tellers' coins. Orcs smell a fight the way sharks smell blood and scrap. They followed the trail of toppled habstacks and the rumor of a green thunder god until the Manufactorum canyons began to boom with their joy. The first truck hurled itself sideways around a dead crane, 3 wheels doing the work of 4 out of pure spite. Boys spilled off it mid-skid, boots clanging, choppers up, mouths open for air they could chew. They saw him, and the wah! Field bulged, belief becoming physics. Physics deciding it was easier to agree. He looked back at them the way a cliff looks at waves. "That's a big un," a knob declared, civic-minded, and then the declaration had to make room for him. He met the first rush in a blur of bad manners. A chain axe came down with enough confidence to end history. He caught the haft and broke it in the quiet part between beats. The knob swung a second axe, because orcs always have a second axe. He headbutted the knob in mid-idea, and the tusks that had been a boast became shrapnel and then regret. He threw 2 boys into a third, and it made a sound like a cupboard falling downstairs. A deaf dread shouldered into the avenue on legs that had opinions, saw the commotion, loved it, and opened 4 arms wide like a drunk uncle at a reunion. It flame-throwered without malice. The heat greased his hide. He leaned into it, blackening, then grabbed the dread's saw-arm at the elbow joint and braced his heel. The dread tried more as a tactic. The tactic screamed and left. He tore the saw free, wedged it into a port where the dread kept its sense of humor, and twisted until the machine spirit decided to become smoke. The dread sat down politely and burst into flame with the dignity of a ship being launched. A weird boy arrived late and already ecstatic, mouth fizzing green, eyes full of the storm only orcs can ride without a map. "Look at him, lads, he's proper." The psychic pressure swelled. The air hiccuped. Bolts of bottled wah snapped toward Dut and the giant like thrown nails. They hit, fizzed, crawled over his shoulders in crawling cataract and of sickly green, and then, oddly, did not want to leave. He shook once, impatient, and the lightning tore itself apart in his wake, strands of belief too embarrassed to stick. "That means he's with us," the weird boy announced helpfully, just before the giant reached him and flicked him into a stack of drums. They went off like kettles at a wedding. The war boss came walking, because real bosses don't run to fights. Fights wait. He wore a stomper's tooth as a pauldron and a power claw the size of a confession. He pushed boys aside by the skull as if they were weeds. He and the green giant considered each other like mountains negotiate rivers. "Nice and green," the boss rumbled. "You the boss?" The giant did not answer with words. They shook hands in the orc tradition, palm to palm, all fingers curled. The ground sat down. The warboss grinned wider, tusks wet. The claw whined up through registers that make men remember their first broken bone. The giant twisted, shoved the angle under his armpit, and the claw met leverage, which is older than war. Pistons shrieked, teeth stripped. Talk turned into confession. The claw died a hero. The boss swung with his other fist and broke his own wrist on a face that had never been introduced to the concept of concession. The return blow lifted him and wrote his name into a wall in a spelling only orcs can read. For a heartbeat, the boys were quiet. Field stuttering, narrative wobbling. And then the wobble corrected. Louder, happier. 100 throats bellowed a new fact into being. The big green boss. The field leapt to wrap him like a flag nobody asked him to wear. A truck painted red, and thus fast, tried to ram him because ramming is hello. He caught the bumper and held, boots sliding furrows in slag. The engine screamed its opinion. He dragged the truck in a circle until its own momentum made it confess and fall on its side, wheels still trying to leave. They loved him for that, too. He tried to leave. They followed, because following a fight is religion. He tried to lead. They followed, because following a boss is also religion. In the confusion of love and collision, a looted Lehman Russ fired point blank and took out a gantry that was trying to witness. He ducked, came up under the Russ, put both hands under the glacis like a man resigning himself to furniture, and lifted. The tank came up reluctant and heavy, and then, a fraction too late, decided it was a bad idea to be airborne. It left, end over end, and met a Killer Khan mid-argument. 2 bad ideas created a good memory. "Dis un's ours," an orc declared with pride. "No," he said, the word low and all gravel. And the war. Field shivered because it had never heard no said with that much weight. He shoved a path through them that was not murder and not consent, palms out, and they, charmed by the refusal, let him pass while promising to find him again for round 2, 3, 8, forever. When he leapt, the field tried to make the jump farther than gravity liked, and gravity, feeling outvoted, compromised. He vanished across a canyon of old cranes with a sound like an argument getting up to leave. The dust had not settled before the ground began to move like an animal shrugging fleas. Shadows rained like insects made of meat. The first mycetic spores hit in wet impacts that taught the rubble about new kinds of stain. Tyranids don't arrive. They happen. The sky vibed with their hunger. Subsonic, total. Gaunts sprinted before their feet found purchase. Rippers poured like hungry sockfuls of knives. A lictor unrolled from the underside of a beam, half seen, and flexed his killing intent like a cat flexes claws. He met them the way a flood meets a staircase, continuously. The first Hormagaunt came in, scissoring. He punted it hard enough that it became a lesson for the ones behind. Termagant beetles rattled across his chest. He wiped them off the way a man wipes off rain. A Carnifex charged because that is the only verb in their language large enough, and he accepted, low, shoulder-braced, like a brawler who has seen too many doors. Horn met humerus. Stone screamed. He slid back a meter, bare feet plowing furrows, then twisted under the horn, hooked both hands into chitin ridges, and wrenched. Plates snapped in laminar waves. He put the Carnifex on its back and ended the conversation with 2 fists and a stone the size of an altar. Spore mines bloomed. gasps of acid like breath from a sick god. The mist crawled along his skin, chemistry trying on poetry. It burned black paths that filled as he watched, smoking deserts turning emerald again in fast motion. A zoanthrope's lance bit him out of nowhere, a thin white spear that arrived already satisfied. It blew a hole through his shoulder the size of a child. He swore in a dialect of pain reserved for people who have broken themselves by choice. The hole webbed shut before the zoanthrope finished gloating. Its brain scream became curious. He picked up the dead carnifex by a leg and hurled it into the zoanthrope the way an angry saint throws a heresy. The collision was medically unhelpful. The ground bulged. Sand geysered. A trigon shouldered out of the earth like a commuter, unhappy with the morning. It struck with 100 hooks and a mouthful of kitchen knives. He caught the mandibles and kept them from his face in an arm wrestle that made the street decide to be canyon. The coils came, the squeeze, the crush. Ribs bent and then remembered defiance. He planted a heel, stomped into a coil, tore it, bit the trigon on the face because sometimes you answer hunger with rudeness. It reared, confused that the food had opinions, and he punched up into the hinge of the jaw until the hinge wasn't. Synapse crackled and re-knit like a psychic Wi-Fi that never drops. A hive tyrant descended with guards like pillars, lash whip hissing, bone-zawed singing ancestry. It dismissed gravity like a suggestion and hung there with the calm malice of bureaucracy. Devourer grubs sprayed like wet gravel. He threw chunks of trigon until the grubs chewed dust instead of him, then leapt, grabbed the tyrant by the tibia, and learned that flying units hate being used as a handle. It hacked at him with a weapon that had lived in 100 hands. The edge kissed his forearm and wrote a thin gospel that suddenly decided it wasn't legible and closed. The tyrant screamed, not in pain, but in a counting error. He yanked it out of air and made air a weapon, slamming it down through a scaffold until the scaffold turned into a list of nails. Guards hammered him with spines the size of javelins. He reached back absently and snapped one, then another, then threw the tyrant into the guards the way a bar bouncer throws problems into each other. He would have ended them there, but the ground shook in a way that insisted on attention, and then a hierodule shouldered into view, each step punching a crater into the Manufactorum's memory of itself. The Biotitan's acid strobe stitched his torso with holes that boiled like soup. It smelled like a slaughterhouse daydream. He sprinted anyway, small under it, and completely enough. The first swing knocked the 3 meters of chitin into next week. The backhand caught him with a forelimb and punted him through a wrecked rail car into a wall that had been a sermon once. He stood. The holes shrank. He leapt, caught a spine ridge, and climbed, handholds breaking under his fingers and then regrowing for him, because the universe has a sense of humor. The hierodule bucked. He rode, shoulders shaking with suppressed laughter that wasn't happiness. He jammed both hands under a dorsal plate and uprooted it in a wet peel, then reached inside a thing that had never wanted hands inside it, and wrenched. The hierodule's scream shook rust off cranes. It found him with a lash of living cable and flung him 40 meters into a pit of rippers. The rippers swarmed, thrilled to be invited. He stood out of them like a man stands out of a lake, and they slid off him, offended at the lack of participation. Endless. That was the danger. Not death. He refused death, and it learned to take no for an answer. but the arithmetic of without end. For every chitin mountain he toppled, another skittered in over the horizon of near. For every scream he slapped into silence, the choir found a new throat. He slowed for the first time, not because he could not move, but because moving had turned into work, the way pushing a continent might be called manual labor. A line of white cut the air like a signature. The lance licked the ground 3 streets away, and everything there forgot to exist. The shockwave slapped gaunts into low orbit. A ridge of glass humped up and then laid down again, polite. He used the miracle like a step, bounded across, and put a manufactorum block between himself and the busiest parts of the hive fleet's appetite. The Tyranids didn't sulk. They do not sulk. They poured around the new scar, lettered it with claws, and learned the angles. He moved on, endless meeting endless, until the swarm slid behind him like weather he had outwalked. He didn't get time to like the silence. The vox changed tone. The ground changed tone. The air went from hot metal to old incense. A knight strode into the avenue with the family tree of a dozen crusades etched into its shin. Banners, torn in tasteful places, said, "We do duty beautifully." A crackling custom force field stolen from orcs and welded to a reliquary said, "Also we cheat." The paladin hailed him out of habit. "You will stand down." Voice, aristocrat choir boy in a cathedral of guns. He did not stand down. He charged. The paladin lowered its reaper chainsword, and wishbone shaped its stance. The first swing drew a gout of emerald and black that hit the ground and wriggled before deciding to be blood. He sank his hands into the knight's greave, fingers curling into adamant as if it had pores. The knight dragged him. He made being dragged into traction. He pivoted his hips, and the world tensed with him. The knight's balance stumbled because laws apply to everyone, even noble houses. He bent the knee. Knights don't kneel unless swearing. This was swearing in a different tense. The pilot, Scion, air expectant of something, gritted teeth and dumped the thermal cannon point blank into a face that would not stop being present. The shot sprayed molten promise. He roared, the sound making the knight's auspex ghost. He shoved the thermal muzzle away, crumpled the housing with both hands, and ripped it free like a tooth you're done with. He beat the knight's face with its own gun until the machine spirit retreated to the last chapel in its head and locked the doors. The princeps in the carapace screamed but did not beg. Scions do not beg to anything that lacks a title. He pulled the knight down by the gorget, got under it with a back, and heaved. For an absurd second, he deadlifted a god, spine a steel cable playing a hymn nobody had asked for. He could not keep it. The knight crashed onto a hab skeleton and sat there, insulted and dying in wail-like whistles. He left it keening and leapt because the ground was shaking in a way that means the audience is finished and the performer is arriving. The warlord's shadow climbed the canyon wall like dawn. Its steps were calendars. Its voids muted the air where they passed. Bullets fired into its presence from hysterical squads simply stopped existing with the gratitude of tired men getting to lie down. Volcano cannon, plasma annihilator, apocalypse launcher. The names are sermons. The reality is heat and certainty. Its princeps, old and threaded into the crew like a king into a ship, saw a blip on cogitators that refused to be scaled sensibly. Moderati. Track the anomaly. Tracked. a voice answered calmly that must have been trained in calm the way steel is trained in carbon. "Hold," the Princeps said, the way mountains might say it to landslides. "We do this cleanly. Machine God, watch us." He didn't hold. He sprinted. The Titan pivoted with the grandeur of geology. The first plasma strike shaved a furrow through a world and wrote part of him out of existence. He fell. He stood. He was smoking like a forge that had loved too hard. The volcano cannon fired, and the air ripped 4 streets behind him into glass. The backwash toppled a crane he had been intending to use as a ladder. He picked up the fallen crane as if changing tools mid-song, and threw it at the void shields. The crane hit and became blue steam. The voids rippled, pleased to validate a manual. He bent, grabbed a slab of ferrocrete the size of a train car, and skimmed it low with a bowler's hip. It hit the void like rain. He threw again, and again. The shield bubble hummed higher. Capacitors wrote prayers and read them back. An onager volunteered itself by accident. He smacked it into a glowing aura, and the field flickered in distaste. The Death Watch sergeant, 2 streets over, watched his own rounds skip and said into the vox, almost admiring, "He's learning siegecraft." "Drop the voids," the Inquisitor said over him. "Bleed them. Every cheap shot. Give him junk to throw." Guard, Skitarii, anybody with a spine and a sling obeyed. Scrap, rocks, dead trucks, the remains of an orc prospecting rig. A hailstorm of disreputable missiles battered the Vale until it hiccuped. The warlord's tech priests chanted, hands in sockets, sobbing devotionals. The bubble winked, flared, dimmed. He chose the moment when a saint would have said, "Now." He leapt. He hit the knee plate with enough truth to make the plate reconsider being a plate. The leg lurched. The whole city felt the weight shift and tried to compensate by praying. He dug into the junction where machine meets tendon, meets promise, and shoved until caps exploded and pistons found out what words like shear and betrayal mean. The warlord staggered. The Princeps took it like a gentleman taking a slap. "Stabilizers," he said. "Vent plasma. Bring the quake to bear." The carapace-mounted quake cannon rang the world. The shock pulverized his footfalls into powder. He slid, left hand buried in a nest of bundled cabling, right hand tearing at a maintenance ladder with a savagery that said ladders should be ashamed for existing. He climbed. The Moderati screamed target data until the screams choked into clicks. The top deck lasered lines through haze like saints pointing. The Apocalypse launcher brayed a volley that turned the street behind him into an argument between rocks. He reached the hip. He jammed fingers into a service hatch, stubborn enough to have killed a dozen tech adepts, and opened it with an obscenity of effort. The hatch tore loose, surprised and insulted. He reached in and tore at whatever was there, not knowing names, but knowing the universal grammar of remove, break, jam. Machine spirits that had known 4,000 years of hymns met hands that didn't care about ancestry and screamed in harpsichord tones. The Titan buckled. Its right leg knelt. The city fell half in love with the sight against its will. "Princeps," a Moderatus whispered. We are going." The Titan's core room groaned under tidal stresses. The plasma annihilator's mag clamps rattled prayers. The old man smiled into his plugs. "Then we go with grace." He put them into the book of correct deaths and reached for the last weapon courtesy would allow. The body. "All hands. Fall." The warlord leaned like a tower that had decided to become a bridge and then a ship, and then none of those. He rode the tilt. boots digging, one hand sunk wrist-deep in a knotted loam of cables, the other punching service ribs into angles they had never wanted to explore. He jumped as it fell. The Titan met the street in convulsions of thunder, and centuries of dust became current and swallowed it in a wave. He hit hard enough to forget where his name had been kept. When he remembered, the Titan was on its side, struggling in a way big things shouldn't have to. He staggered up. He went back to the knee. He finished. In the silence, after all the shouting, the engine's heart clicked down the way old clocks do. The Princeps closed his eyes, saw the cathedral of steel he had been wed to light from within, and go dark in organs, not all at once, and whispered an apology to a god that likes apologies most when they're unnecessary. He died at his post. The machine settled, huge, wrong, asleep forever. He stood with dust making armor where he had none. The softness under his feet flooded back into the world, timid. Voxes found voices again. Somewhere behind, men laughed and cried in the stupid way survival makes you, because relief is the most embarrassing virtue. He didn't bask. He turned. There are always more directions to go. A howl like a comet remembered. It had bones rolled down the avenue and became a wraith knight shouldering through a skein of billowing spirit shields, runes winking like eyes. Eldar don't arrive late. They arrive as if time had been their idea. The giant in wraith bone assessed him with the clean disdain of an artist looking at a hammer. It came on points of light. Sun cannons flashed, dumping contained sun at a problem that refused to be physics. He crossed the stream like a boulder crosses a brook, altering it, ignoring it. The Eldar giant pivoted like water, blade arms in a dance that had been practiced for centuries in rooms with white floors and no dust. He punched. The Wraith Knight wasn't there. It stabbed. He was. The blade wrote a line in him, and the line healed while the ink was still wet. The pilot, a soul braided into wraith bone, felt curiosity for the first time in years, and hated it. He fainted high. The humanish thing didn't take it because it wasn't a student of feints. It was a student of gravity. He caught a blade wrist and yanked, drawing the ghost's grace into the world where leverage is law. They wrestled, one graceful, one inevitable. The elder found a moment, a perfect step, and kicked him away so beautifully it should have been framed. He hit a wall. The wall lost. The duel would have become art if orcs hadn't crash-returned like a punchline riding rockets, or if the Tyrannid vanguard hadn't chosen that block of second horizons to pour down another fissure, or if a quake in the warlord's corpse hadn't opened a new corridor deeper into the manufactorum's bowels. The city decided to be 3 fights at once because that is what cities do when asked complicated questions. He moved through it like weather unscrupulous about geography. Orcs howled love songs and got launched into Tyrannids, who accepted them as calories and got interrupted by shrapnel from a collapsing Titan's shoulder. A weird boy tried to make him red so he goes faster, and for 2 chaotic minutes the giant flickered carmine at the edges and did indeed go faster, horrifying 3 Mechanicus observers into ecstasy. A brood lord ambushed him from a shadow it had been saving since birth and got introduced to a knee that had no manners. The Wraith Knight took a headshot from a tiger shark that had decided rules were boring and stumbled long enough for him to tear a carapace panel free and throw it through an oncoming Defcopter that learned what decapitation means at scale. The librarian, watching from a ledge of almost safety, tasted pennies and stubbornness and a distant laugh that wasn't from a mouth. He pushed a ward into the air, like a father pushes a child behind him without looking. The ward held. The Kulexus paced the trench of absence like a shark that had made peace with being the ocean. Sisters shifted. Quiet overlapped. The Inquisitor raised a hand and lowered it, and 4 squads moved as if telegraphed by the hand's bones. He threw a monolith. It's important not to skip that. The Necron construct had simply stood up out of memory and said no to the world, as is its habit. It had begun to do geometry at people. He tore it up. He tore it not because he knew its name or cared for its age, but because it was between him and the next thing to push. It slid along the ground, protesting in a language that is all edges, and arrived at a cliff as a fact, and left as a lesson. War is a book with many fonts, most of them rude. He read quickly. He bled where it helped. He didn't where it didn't. He punched through a stomper's knee and came out of the cutlass of falling metal like a swimmer, arriving at the surface, furious at oxygen. He ripped a trigon like old rope. He climbed a wraith knight like a wrong ladder and found a grace note in the seam of plates and turned it into wrong music. He felt his anger meet the place where the warp waits to harmonize, and the silence the sisters brought held like a hand over a mouth, and his anger stayed his. In the tiny spaces between shouts, prayers, explosions, there were other noises. A guardsman telling a friend to breathe. A tech adept making comforting sounds to a busted onager, as if it could hear comfort. An orc explaining to another orc that if you paint a fist red, it goes faster, which is why his fist hurt more this time. A lictor making a noise like scissors in the next room. A knight scion quietly reciting his house's covenant to the dead god inside his machine. The librarian murmuring an hold to a ward that wanted to fall asleep. The Inquisitor whispering here to fate like a gambler to a card. He didn't hear any of that. He heard beating, his own, the world's. He moved toward whatever sounded like no, and turned it into something that could be lifted. Far to the west, a Forge Worlds Vox lit with messages from petitioners who wanted to buy data about the green anomaly's structural secrets. Far to the east, a war band of iron worshippers debated whether this thing could be made into a demon engine if you whispered at it long enough and fed it saints. Far above, a small Eldar child looked into a pool that showed tomorrow and laughed because in one version, the giant wore an orc hat, and that was funny, and in another he knelt, and in a third he walked out of the frame and did not come back. He didn't belong in any of those futures. He belonged to his next verb. When the city gave him a titan to topple, he toppled it. When the sky gave him chitin to crack, he cracked it. When belief tried to put a crown on him, he broke the crown and kept going. When silence gave him a place to breathe, he breathed and shoved at the quiet to see if it would shove back. He wasn't winning. Winning is a story you tell at the end. He was fighting, and in the Grimdark, fighting is a verb that keeps the lights on long enough for stories to have time to happen. The Manufactorum roared approval in languages it didn't know it had, and the green shape moved through it with a kind of rude grace that turned every enemy into a lesson, and every lesson into momentum. The last act begins with a choice, or a failure to choose quickly enough. A dozen plans, 6 doctrines, and 1 stubborn superstition collide in the ruins of a Manufactorum-turned temple. On the floor, chalk sigils and saint ashes, blood in neat cups, cables in indecent knots. Above, skull drones orbiting like anxious planets. In between, a corridor of hush arranged by sisters, a lattice of time arranged by priests, a geometry of overlapping grave wells arranged by men who refuse to believe in miracles but will commission their likeness if they work. He arrives in a sprint that drags the horizon along behind him, green thunder made of ribs and refusal. The first net clings, the second bites, the third learns, the fourth holds. He drops to a knee like a continent negotiating with a tectonic plate. The Culexus walks closer, the world dimming around the assassin as if light is embarrassed. The librarian pours chains of thought into air, each syllable a nail. The Death Watch sergeant puts a boot on a collarbone and forgets to breathe for 3 measured seconds. The Inquisitor raises a hand. The stasis snaps shut like the lid of a sarcophagus that cost too much to be wrong. In one ending, he wakes only on the clock. The vault they build for him is a cathedral to necessary sin. A torus of adamantium and contrition hangs in low orbit over a desert moon that never learned a name. Inside, a cradle they call a reductor, a coffin that can breathe, ringed in null lattice, flooded with machine prayers. The Margos who signs it weeps not because they are sad. Tears are just coolant sometimes. They call the program Thunder Reliquary in public logs, and something uglier in the ones that open only to rosettes and oaths. It works like this. Choose a war you are already losing. Choose a target the Navy cannot convince to become light. Thread the vault's mouth through re-entry wrapped in ablative litanies. Unwrap the lid. Speak the word. Hope. The first deployment is surgical by the standards of the far future, which is to say, obscene. A tendril of Leviathan breathes on Vardek 9's atmospheric skin. The vault kisses the exosphere and hisses. The cradle opens with a noise like winter on a blade. He falls, awake, in a tube of not silence, stasis blooming petals of frost along the edges of their courage. The timer in the Inquisitor's palm is a coin turning end over end. He hits a spawning pit at the center of a chittering lake. For 6 minutes and 19 seconds, the longest span any of them will live to call small, the hive fleet forgets how to be a swarm and remembers how to be a list of parts. He drowns the synapse node in its own wires, rips a malanthrop until it is only a smell, tears the lid off an enzyme pool, and bathes like a judgment. The choirs in orbit go from bleeding to singing to a strange, empty normal as the warp song stutters. He claws a trench in the biomass and for 10 extravagant seconds stands still. He looks up. He knows. The Culexus drops into the trench like a blade that hates melody. The sisters overlap their absence until it's a room built of nothing. The cradle descends as if ashamed of itself. The lattice holds. The lid closes on a roar that shakes weight off every shoulder above. They run the weapon twice more. Once on a Necron tomb world, where he rips a monolith out of space so rudely that reality apologizes with sparks. Once on an orc scrap moon, where the Wah field tries to adopt him, and the sisters' geometry has to be redrawn mid-mission. The third time, a ritual hiccup lets the warp put its mouth to the edge of the cradle and whisper to the anger inside in vowels that taste like knives. The cradle closes late. 7 seconds. In those 7 seconds, an Eversaw unhoods. 4 Palatine Wardens step into a space the size of a bad thought and do things that end with the word grapple. The Dreadnought crushes a brace until it remembers obedience. The librarian bleeds and calls it ink. The lid claps like a trap on a wolf that finally learned its own paw. The word from Terra is as short and old as a scar. Enough. They hang him where the galaxy keeps its secrets. Basilica Silentium, deep vault, no ceremony. 12 sisters sit Shiva around a window that shows nothing. The Dominus petitions once a decade for study rights under incontestable conditions, and is refused with the kind of politeness that says friendship has limits, and they are here. A scribe assigned to the vault writes an anonymous tract called On the Ethics of Using Earthquakes. As doors, then burns it, then burns the memory of it. On a quiet day, a choir boy stands in the hallway outside the vault and realizes the tinnitus he has carried since birth is gone. Over centuries, the story frays. Gamma Prime becomes a warning, then a charge in a heresy trial, then a joke soldiers tell about requisitioning miracles. No one laughs near the quiet door. They do not run thunder reliquary again. They keep the glass unbroken. When hive fleets push, when warlord engines kneel, when saints fail and storms go out, men stand outside the door and imagine opening it. And then they imagine it opening on its own, and then they go back to their posts and settle for courage. In another telling, he stops being a prisoner the first time he realizes that silence is a kind of chain. It happens during the third binding on Vardek 9, at the intersection where the hush is thickest and the lattice is humble and effective. A sister steps half a pace too near, using her life like a plug. The pariah field surges. The warp is muzzled so cleanly the librarian can hear his own pulse detune. The green tower in the net hiccups, bites his lip hard enough to cut, and shakes the taste of quiet out of his head like water from an ear. The sky answers. It tears, not like paper, but like a throat clearing. Brass light pours into a world that thought it had enough light already. A bloodthirster comes through, starved and furious and beautiful, in the way theater is beautiful when it thinks it's real. It hits the ground in a gallop that breaks geometry, shakes its chain like a man shakes a leash he resents, screams love for violence into the air until the air does what all love does under pressure and becomes dangerous. He meets it with the blank sincerity of a punch. No tools, no artifacts, no god name on his tongue. He learns the chain's angle mid-swing and wrenches, using the demon's own momentum to betray the demon's neck. They dance the ugly waltz that war thinks is tasteful. Chain, horn, knee, claw, bite. The librarian tightens his wards until he goes blind. The sisters step closer until their bones hum like tuning forks, until hair lifts on the backs of necks 50 meters away, until the bloodthirster's shadow behaves like any other shadow. He breaks it across a fallen pylon. It shatters in a kind of relief. The collar lands in the dust with a sound that writes a sentence. He picks the collar up, and it does not burn him. It does not restrain him. It sets like a crown is a kind of hand. The laugh from the not sky is percussion on a battlefield. Horn does not anoint. Horn recognizes. That is enough. Brass scars appear along green skin. Filigree without permission. Raised words written in metal nobody mind. No gifts. Permission for more. No bargains. Endorsement of a habit. The next months cannot be counted in days. They are counted in storms. He leaves the manufactorum, makes a door in the air with his hands, because a door has a shape, and he is good with shapes, and walks into a place where ground is a suggestion, and horizon is a lie. A fleshhound pack meets him, and he breaks their collars so they can be honest. World eaters, war bands gather around him with the ecstatic awe of men who have found a new font and do not care if it is poison. A skull-taker kneels and calls him a name in a language of cuts. He kills the skull-taker because hierarchy is a lid, and he breaks lids. Chaos armies adjust. Abaddon glances sideways and updates a plan. Angron looks up from a battlefield made of nouns that mean bleed, and performs a snort that serves as benediction in that cathedral. In the Eye of Terror, a storm picks up a name and starts moving independently of the winds that birthed it. It is not a demon prince. It is a refusal that the warp has decided to host for the entertainment value. He does not wear armor. He does not bless weapons. He carries the idea of a chain in his hands and wraps it around Titans' ankles and drags them screaming to their knees. He wades into grey night liminal zones, and their wards hold. Saints remember their lines in a play that has never had improvisation. And still he breaks a few. He meets a custodian spear tip on a nameless baron near the Emperor's Light, and the custodians do something no one has seen them do in 10,000 years. They step back one pace to think, and then forward again, and the world learns new meanings for costly. He tears a black ship out of the warp, not because he hates it, but because it's in the way. He pushes a Black Crusade spear off course with his shoulder and laughs like a split mountain. The Imperium coins a classification it does not print. Exalted of Wrath, Unbound. The Sororitas write 2 new hymns no one ever sings. The Mechanicus forges 6 new kinds of null iron that don't work. Where he goes, planets flip to the red calendar. Where he leaves, gravity keeps his dent as a souvenir. Khorne finds the disobedience refreshing. A champion who will not kneel, but will kill everything kneeling asks him to. The brass throne accumulates another story. The warp echoes with it, until the echo is a geography. The Deathwatch sergeant grows old watching the storm's edges from worlds that still think they're on maps. The librarian's hair goes white in a day the first time the storm bares teeth at him and has the manners to stop. The Inquisitor who first named Gamma Prime becomes a cautionary tale told to officials who think naming is ownership. Somewhere. On a shrine world of cracked red earth, a priest puts a collar on a statue of a giant and says it's a relic from a time when gods tried new shapes. No one asks whether Khorne will be bored someday. Boredom is a different god sin. In a third ending, green meets green, and the laugh never stops. He does not mean to be theirs. He tries very hard not to be. The orcs are patient in the way surf is patient with cliffs. They crash, they erode, they polish, they crown. It begins in the Manufactorum canyons with a warboss's claw dying against his ribs like a bad idea meeting daylight. It continues 2 weeks later on a scrap world where grots have built a parabolic dish out of bed frames to catch a rumor. And the rumor comes true, riding on a meteor of trucks. He refuses a crown twice, so they make the crown a punching contest, and he accepts on principle. "Da Smasher Prophet!" Someone screams over the chant, half heresy, half administrative. The name sticks because the field likes jokes that rhyme. The woe. Field is a liar, and the best kind of friend. It tells the universe what it wants to hear until the universe agrees out of exhaustion. Under that green hum, he jumps farther, lands softer, hits harder, heals faster, and begins to smell like engine grease and roast squig. He is not orcified. He is accompanied. Mechs climb him like a ruin to bolt on gubbins that don't stick and then do. Their custom force fields love him like a favorite bad idea. Weird boys lean close and whisper recipes for thunder into his ear, then hide behind rocks when the thunder takes it personally. He does not command. He arrives, and that is command enough. Clans that hate each other's paint scheme for religious reasons march parallel, because parallel lines eventually meet if the universe is kind, and orcs assume it will be. Speed freaks ride donuts around his footprints like saints circling relic bones. Bad moons finance a fleet of stompers named after verbs. Blood axes sell tickets to fights with a suspicious number of seats. Freebooters rename their flagship DA Big Green Fist and paint his snarl on the prow. The prow bites a riptide in half, and nobody questions the causality. They make a crusade in Orc. It is halfway migration, halfway stomp, all applause. Systems fall into a polyphonic cackle. The Ta'u say, contain, and get disassembled politely. Necrons say, denied, and get used as furniture. The Adeptus Astartes say, here we stand, and mean it and suffer it, and write new litanies for Knuckles. A Lord Solar orders Exterminatus on 4 worlds in a belt to make a gap the War will trip on. It trips, laughs, uses the gap as a ramp, clears a moon, lands in a forge ring, and renovates it. Gazkul hears and either decides to fight him to see whose teeth are history, or decides to fight beside him because the idea of 2 prophets is a pun so good it should be illegal. Accounts conflict because witnesses mostly died of happiness. On some worlds, black and yellow and green banners fly together for an afternoon that lasts 6 months. On others, the 2 largest shadows ever cast by individual egos grapple on an asteroid until the asteroid becomes sand and their laughter becomes a kind of gravity. A mech shows up one day with a blueprint too big for a table. A gargant that is also a moon, that is also a fist. Dis-un-punches planets, the mech explains. Scientific. They build it with the same attention to detail that produced other civilization-shattering triumphs, i.e., they rivet joy to mass until mass agrees. When it throws a punch, tides register. When it misses, continents get new coastlines. The Imperium names the thing an abomination, and the orcs paint an abomination's grin on its knuckles. Segmenta mobilize. Phalanxes turn. A battle fleet breaks its own speed limits and arrives with doctrine sharpened to a needle. They pick a fortress world with curtain walls like continent edges and dare the War to come break its teeth. The War obliges because teeth are tools. The fight is a season. It has holidays. Pilgrims come to die properly. Pain boys set up tents with cheery skull bunting. Field scribes fill codices with notes like, if green laughter persists more than 3 months, consult confessors. The fortress holds long enough to be called history, and then fails suddenly, as if pulled out from underneath itself by a punchline. In the aftermath, an Ordo Xenos conclave coins a new designation, never spoken outside sigil-lit rooms. Prophet class. The Inquisitor who once signed for Gamma Prime reads the report and closes their eyes. Somewhere, on a world they will never see, children invent a game called the Hulk's Footsteps and jump farther than physics should allow, because physics is soft-hearted with children sometimes. Does he end? The War never ends. It disperses like a thunderhead and then finds mountains somewhere else. He is either lost in the press of 1,000,000 greenskins, alive in a rumor told in a canteen with bad soup, or last seen punching a moon until it becomes a ring because rings is proper. The ring hangs over a dead sun and makes tides for things that have no seas. Somewhere very far away, the ring looks like a wedding band, and somebody writes a poem they will not admit to. A rarer ending belongs to quiet people and romantics. It is a small world, the kind administratum scribes love because the columns add up. It has 2 moons, one of which is cracked. The crack is not this world's fault. It is a memory someone else hung in its sky. The people plant and sing and eat and fight small fights over irrigation quotas and love like amateurs. The Inquisition stamps it uninteresting with a relief that borders on sentiment. On a hill nobody uses because the wind is rude, a big man sits with his back to a ruin of saints that looks like ship ribs. He is wrapped in a cloak that used to be 3 cloaks. On the ground beside him, a plowshare he has been pretending is a friend. His hands are clean in the way hands get clean after you have washed them 100 times and still see things. He watches the cracked moon like a man reading a letter from himself. There are no sisters here, no choirs, no dreadnoughts hum. A single servitor tends a weather station that lies for a living. A single bird tries on 6 songs in the morning and settles for the one that annoys the bird 3 trees over. A single boy brings a basket of bread rolls and puts them down and runs away, and only later learns how to walk up to a giant like a person. He is Bruce for a while. This is not an amnesty. This is a budget. The universe saves to afford it. He helps with a harvest and forgets to break the handles of things. He refuses a fight with a man who needs one, and the man breaks his own nose on the refusal and becomes better. A drill tractor digs in a field, and he lifts it gently, and no one sees. The boy grows into a foreman, and the foreman stops stuttering when he talks to tall people. The seasons knit a sweater over everything. Sometimes the wind shifts wrong, and quiet becomes heavy. He grips his knees. He breathes like a man trying to keep a door shut against weather. On the bad days, he walks the ridge until his feet invent a groove, and the groove becomes a line you can see from orbit, and some cartographist labels it Lazy River, because cartographers are small gods. On the worst day of all, a Navy patrol drops in drunk on authority and makes a mistake. He makes sure the mistake leaves. He leaves after it. He leaves a footprint in the clay that turns to stone because the clay decides to keep it. Years later, a pilgrim finds the footprint and decides it's a sign that giants were kind once. People bring flowers. The wind is still rude. The cracked moon looks like a smile if you lie to yourself just right. The Inquisition knows. It has known the whole time. Sometimes mercy is doctrine too. There are other versions, because there are always other versions. A kill team sergeant dies with his bolt gun empty and finally believes he has done enough. A librarian loses his voice and speaks only with his hands, and discovers his oaths have more room in them now. A Dominus makes a machine that hates music and realizes, with something like grief, that they have made a church. An Inquisitor retires and is buried in unmarked stone because names are not the point. An orc tells a story so good about a fist that punched a titan in half that it becomes true on a world 3 jumps west. Somewhere in the eye, a brass chain swings over a throne, warm from a neck that won't wear it. Somewhere in a vault, A heartbeat wakes in a box not because the clock says so, but because someone said his name too loud. Somewhere on a hill, a plowshare rusts, and that is what iron is for. And in every telling, the same closing argument waits. In the grim darkness of the far future, answers are blunt instruments. This one just happened to like bluntness. If you had the rosette, which fate would you sign? Lock the storm in a silent cathedral and gamble it only when entire worlds are the ante. Let wrath crown itself and redraw the storms inside the eye. Or paint your flag green and ride the biggest wah the galaxy's ever seen until the stars are laughing teeth. Maybe you'd risk the quiet way, betting on a man under all that noise. Tell me which timeline you'd stamp into the archive, and what impossible what if you want us to throw into the 40th millennium next.